It's good to see you. I'm excited to be with you to talk about a topic today, overcoming lust with other-centered love. It's a tough one to talk about, so I'll try to be as gentle as possible. If you're struggling with aspects of this topic, don't get discouraged. We can get to a new place. Recently, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, I was sitting watching a graduation, and a friend of mine, a man by the name of Luis Cortez, who works in the Hispanic community, he's a leader in the Hispanic community, he leans over and whispers in my ear, "Chris, you got to read a book." And I said, "Well, what's the book? I like books. What's the book?" And the title of the book was Pornified. Pornified. The Roman world itself was a pornified world. Paul's world was a pornified world. If Paul stayed in a Roman inn or a Greek inn, he'd likely encounter painted on the walls pornographic images of sorts. If he walked down the street of a major city, he'd probably encounter pornographic statuary. He was constantly confronting portrayals of human sexuality that he knew would damage God's precious image bearers. Think about our globally pornified world. Think about all the nastiness and brutality and suffering that's erupting around us. Sexual exploitation on a grand scale, sexual slavery, the sexual abuse of children. In previous sessions, I talked about the difference between an ordered desire and a disordered desire. And what lust is, it's sexual desire that's disordered rather than ordered. It's objectifying somebody. It's turning a person in that wonderful reality into a thing. So there's a poison that's leaking out into our world, principally because one thing has been turned upside down. What's the antidote that can kill that poison within us? Other-centered love. Other-centered love, where the other is another person, not a thing, and where we learn to center our love on that person in such a way that we would never objectify them. How would a desert dweller define lust? They had a very specific definition. Lust is lusting after bodies. A body is part of what a human being is. But is a body all that a human being is? And they understood this, and they themselves at times struggled with lust. And that phrase, lusting after bodies, pretty much captures what lust is about. Well, there was a well-known church father, perhaps, at least in the Western world, the greatest theologian ever produced, other than perhaps Thomas Aquinas. And he was a man by the name of Augustine. And Augustine readily acknowledged that in his pre-Christian days, he was trapped by lust. Trapped by lust. And he talks about his will. Now think about your will. I would say through the power of God, we need to change our will. We need to move in a new direction. We need to develop an ordered will rather than a disordered will. And so Augustine readily acknowledged that his will was in chains. That's a quote. His will was in chains. Through repeated thoughts and actions, the power of his will to do the right thing sexually had become crippled. His description is, there were now links in a chain in my will. My will had become deeply disordered. deeply disordered. So the question, I like the image of a change for how we can begin to move in a new direction in this particular area of lust. How can we cut the chains of behavior that would cause us to be people of lust rather than people of love? And it's possible to do so. Augustine himself moved from having a disordered love, which was lust, to having a much more ordered love, not simply towards the women he was engaged with, but towards the community that he became bishop of. He changed. He changed by snipping the chains that led to a particular attitude and behavior by changing the way he was thinking, changing the way he was acting, and slowly, over time, changing this deeply ingrained in pattern. I want to encourage you, if you're feeling sad right now, I want to encourage you, it's possible to change. If you feel like I am so deeply addicted to objectifying folks, it's possible to change. Do you remember Abba Moses? Abba Moses was not only a violent man, he later shared he was terribly lustful in terms of how he's treating folks. And Abba Moses chained. So let's now gather around in the living room. There's a knock on the door, and we have the treat of being with two Abbas. And they say, we know what you're struggling with. We know what lust is. We both experienced it. Allow us to coach a bit. Just take a moment to ponder. What do you think Augustine might say to you? What do you think Abba Moses might say to you? I think the first thing they would say is guard your thought life. Guard your thought life. There's a phrase in the scripture that's an interesting phrase, which speaks of the believer as having the mind of Christ. Women felt very safe around Jesus. They felt very safe around Jesus. They liked to be with Jesus because they knew his mind was such that the idea of objectifying one of his beloved creatures was simply absent. I believe that Jesus, being fully human, had genuine sexual feelings and attractions. They're normal, but they never crossed the line. They never crossed the line into objectifying someone. So I think a good exercise, maybe if you have a journal, Abba Moses and Abba Augustine would say, take a look at how you've been thinking. How did those thoughts develop? How might you possibly change the chain of thoughts that leads to a given behavior? Ponder that. I think that they might say, find a good mentor. Find a good coach. Find someone who's fairly earthy. Someone who's not shy to talk about sex. Someone who's, I know they would say this, someone who's older and experienced. Someone who's not going to yell and scold. Someone who knows how reality is put together, how life works. Find a mentor like that and listen to what she has to say. Listen to what he has to say. Here's another principle I think both of these folks, these Abbas, were high on. Know yourself. Know yourself. And know what your occasions of sin are. Here's what they mean. You know, I'm wired a certain way. I have a certain life history, certain DNA, certain family background, certain life experiences, and so on. What tempts me might not tempt you. We're not all tempted by the same things. So know yourself and be honest at this point. Do know and acknowledge what does tempt you. There's an older Christian phrase, occasions of sin. Now, what's an occasion of sin? Well, it's when you enter into a certain environment or exposed to a certain idea. It could be a certain song, it could be a certain film. And for you, when you encounter that particular situation, you find your mind drifting or your behavior drifting in a direction you don't want it to go. Some folks, when they get tired, it might be the end of a long day, their defenses are down. It might be an invariable time of day. The defenses are down. For them, that's not the time to turn on the computer. Ponder that with me. What are those particular occasions of sin for me? And you know, when I move in that certain direction, when I'm tired, for folks, God's precious folks, oftentimes when they get physically tired, temptation becomes more heated. When people are discouraged, maybe, discouraged with what's going on in their lives, disillusioned perhaps or disappointed with God, temptations become more heated. Know what those times are, recognize them, and the behaviors that tend to accompany the temptation will slowly change. And you'll be encouraged by that. Now, this is going to sound a little funny. I'm big on this one. Nurture innocence in your life. Nurture innocence in your life. When I was reading the book Pornified, I knew I had to stop because I was learning about stuff I didn't need to know about. I didn't need to know about certain practices I'd never heard of. That would be too much of a burden to bear for the way I'm wired. So I'm just smiling now. What could be better than becoming innocent once again? You know, if we've been moving in this direction in terms of our lifestyle practices, habit formation, and so on, the wonder of what desert spirituality is about is that, and Jesus and what he's about, is we can begin to move in the opposite direction. In some ways, our memory can change. So pursue innocence. If sexual love involves learning to control the self with other directed love, I wouldn't be surprised, I hope you're not, that both Augustine and Abba Moses would say, work at developing self-control in other areas. So if I can learn to be more controlled in how I'm speaking to people, if I can learn to control my anger, if I can learn to control my envy, if I can learn to control my appetite for food, I can learn to control myself, what we're talking about here. I can learn, probably with a good mentor, learn to control myself in the area of how I'm behaving sexually. I'm going to be reading a story now to close out our time by a friend of mine. Her name is Rebecca Conondike DeYoung. The book is Glittering Vices. Lust dehumanizes the other. In fact, lust needs to dehumanize the other. Lust doesn't work when the other person's fully human. That's why exotic dancers always have fake stage names. You would never have a dancer use her real name. Why not? Because that gets in the way of objectification that lust needs. A man leering at an exotic dancer doesn't want to know her real name. A great way to empty out these clubs would be to stand up before a dancer who's about to come on and say, "This is Sultry Susan, but her real name is Mary Walensky. She has 4 brothers and sisters. Her parents divorced when she was 5. Her mother's an alcoholic. She's been married twice. Her last husband beat her. She has 2 kids and is struggling to get by. She likes dogs and wants to be a dental hygienist. That would empty out the room. An introduction like that would short circuit the lust because it would put intimacy and humanity back into the picture. Lust doesn't want the full humanity of the person with her needs and vulnerabilities. Lust wants low lights, a haze of alcohol. Let's kiss lust goodbye and welcome the real thing, love for another precious image bearer.